Tonight in our series on Christian character, we're talking about developing a godly self-image. Why do you think so many people today struggle with a poor self-image?
Because of family and of friends that just keep telling them that they're not who they should be or something. And
Okay.
I want to share something with you, Pastor. If I may.
Unrealistic expectations.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to share something with you. I locked her kids next to a lady. Her name was Dora Veith, because her name was Alice and Veith, you know. And so every day when she came to school, I made sure I said she was a very pretty woman. I always thought it was a pretty girl. I always thought she was very attractive and stuff. Every day I said that to her. Well, when I went to college, she came to I was working at my dad's gas station. She came to my dad's gas station and wanted to know why I wasn't going to marry her.
Mm.
I have another woman I'm getting married. We're getting married in about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But I love you, you know. And I thought maybe I did something that wasn't right. But I was just trying to tell her how pretty she was. You know, and she took it wrong, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And we do live in a time where we have to be careful about how we compliment people, because sometimes that can be taken the wrong way. One of the things I think affects this, that a lot of people in our culture and society have a poor self-image, is because a lot of people make money off of those poor self-images. You have people trying to sell a product, and so they make you feel as though if you don't use that product, there's something wrong with you, or that those who use their product are somehow better than you. It's called marketing. And in an age in which we're bombarded with images and messages from TV, the computer, your phone now, we're bombarded with these images that we have to have this or do that in order to be the right kind of person. So I think we live in an age in which this is a critical concern. And the fact is that people make a lot of money off of selling the idea that you're not what you could be or should be. What are some of the tangible ways that a poor self-image can affect a person's life?
Suicide.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not to that extent, sometimes your self-confidence can be limited, and some people may hesitate to attempt some things because they become convinced that they're not good enough. It can show itself in something as simple as a person's shyness, not being willing to interact with other people because they're afraid somehow that they will embarrass themselves. The call of Moses, and that's what we're going to be looking at. We're focusing on Exodus chapters 3 and 4. Exodus 3 and 4. The call of Moses has long been a fascination for those in the Judeo-Christian tradition. In some ways, we see the humanity of Moses most clearly in his call narrative. But we also see in that narrative the power and the persistence of God. Look at Exodus chapter 3, and let's look at verses 1 through 15. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations. Now, in verse 4, God immediately calls Moses by name. What does this tell Moses about God?
That he knows who he is.
He knows who he is. God is intimately acquainted with Moses. And that should bear some weight with what Moses is called to do. Why do you think God sent Moses to Pharaoh? Why would he choose Moses?
Well, he was chosen when he was a baby, that he was going to be the
Right.
one that's going to, and so.
So background possibly had something to do with
Sure.
that. God was at work preparing Moses for this moment years before this time, right? Yeah.
About 80 years, yeah.
Yeah,
Just about
yeah.
80 years, yeah.
Moses shows a certain degree of humility here, and maybe that was important. Maybe that was something that indicated that he was willing to do what he was told to do. And yet there's a sense of persistence about Moses as well, and that may have been important as well.
Right.
So God knows Moses. He knows Moses' qualifications. And even though Moses has trouble seeing that, God knows who he is, and God has been preparing him for this for a long time. This is not just something that is suddenly developed.
Right.
What are the objectives Moses raises in verses 11 through 15? And what do they tell us about Moses' view of himself and God? What's Moses' first response when God calls him?
Well, Moses is telling you he's not, who am I?
Yeah, who am I?
Yeah.
Who am I?
I'm nobody. Yeah.
Right. And then what's the next thing he says? Well, what if they ask, what is your name? What do I tell them? So, Moses says, I'm a nobody. He says, they won't believe me. What does that tell us about Moses? Moses is struggling with his self-image here.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. This is holding Moses back at this point. What else does it tell us about God?
God is patient.
Yeah, God is patient.
Very patient.
Yeah. And God is not so much interested in what we are able to do.
Right.
He wants us to be willing to let Him do things through us. Okay? So, how does God reply to Moses? What does He say when Moses says, what if they ask, what is your name?
God said to Moses, I am who I am.
I am who I am. What an interesting statement.
Yeah.
Part of that means that there's really no way to humanly describe God.
Right.
You can't compare, when we describe things, we compare those things to something else. There's no way to really compare God to anything else. God is holy, is separate, He is above. So he says, I am who I am. One of the most interesting aspects of this call narrative is its setting. And the fact that it takes place far from the religious community. Most of the time in the Bible, when someone is called by God, there is a close connection to the religious community by either some type of structure or some group of people. But here, it's far from those things. There are no people around.
Right.
There's no structure around.
Right.
Before Moses sees the burning bush, there's nothing to indicate that this is a holy place. It's simply, the wilderness, the place where the flocks are fed. There's nothing to indicate that there's anything special about this place. It's interesting that Moses gets this call because he's neither a priest nor a prophet. We do know what happened with his birth. We remember that. But he has not been singled out as a priest or a prophet. He's a common shepherd with no discernible religious inclinations, no evident gifts for leadership. And yet God calls him. When you read through Scripture, of course, you realize that that's kind of God's way, isn't it? God has a knack for doing that, for calling people whom we would not consider to be well qualified for what God is asking them to do. As readers, we know more than Moses. We are told that Mount Horeb is the mountain of God. Moses doesn't know this at the time. He's simply told that at some point in the future, after he's led the Israelites out of Egypt, that they will worship God on that mountain, and that will be a sign. Kind of late for a sign, isn't it? I'm thinking Moses probably wants a sign before it gets to that point. Well, the sign really is the burning bush. And technically, it's not a burning bush. What it is, when you read the Hebrew, what it is a flame of fire in the midst of a bush that does not consume the bush. So it's even more mysterious than simply a bush that catches fire in the middle of nowhere. There's this fire burning in the bush, and yet the bush is not consumed. Moses is drawn by this sight, as we might well imagine. If we saw something like that, we'd pay attention to it. And so he turns aside to look at it. He's curious. God, of course, has a way of using human curiosity. He calls to Moses. The sound seems to emanate from the bush. And that's significant. God has not sent a messenger here. We read of other places where God sends an angel, or he sends some type of messenger, or he speaks through one of the prophets. God doesn't send a messenger here. He serves as his own messenger. This is a highly personal encounter. And I think one reason for that is because of the self-image that Moses struggles with. And so God himself appears to Moses. We know that it's not unusual for the presence of God to be portrayed in Scripture as fire. We saw that on the incident on Mount Sinai. We remember that the children of Israel were led in the wilderness by a pillar of fire at night. So it's not unusual for the appearance of God to be in the form of a flame. There's an emphasis here on divine initiative. God chooses Moses, God appears on earth, and God personally calls Moses. So there's divine initiative at work here. He tells him, come no closer and remove your sandals. This place wasn't holy before, but what's different about it now?
God's there now.
God is there now. So it's holy because God is present. And so some distance must be maintained. And the removal of one's sandals was a sign of respect. God identifies himself. He says, I'm the God of your father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He ties his identity to to the family tree of Moses. And it is only at this point, when he realizes that he is being approached by God, that Moses becomes afraid. We're told that he hides his face. The tradition was that no one could see the face of God or an image of God and live. And so Moses hides his face in fear. He's not afraid, however, of having a conversation with God. He's not afraid of questioning God as they go through their dialogue with one another. Between chapter 3, verse 4 and chapter 4, verse 17, God speaks to Moses 13 times. Moses responds each time. 6 times, it's in a non-verbal way. The responses can range from initial deference. In 3:6, we see him hiding his face, to immediate obedience, which we see in chapter 4, verses 3 through 7, to questioning or demurral. We see in 3:11 where he says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" And then we see that again in chapter 4, verse 10. What do these exchanges tell us? Well, first of all, Moses' struggle is real. There is a lack of personal self-confidence here. There's a lack of leadership capacity. Moses does not have the ambition to do this initially. And so he is resistant. And that's very real for Moses. He's not playing a game here. He honestly is afraid of being put in this position that he will not be qualified to do what God is asking him to do. Moses, however, can be bold and persistent. And God is revealed as one who takes seriously the concerns expressed by Moses. He answers him. He does not pat or just kind of slough off the concerns that Moses has. He responds directly to them. Rather than overpowering Moses, God is willing to work with him. And so Moses becomes God's partner, not his puppet. Notice that the deliverance that God offers to the Israelites is not just deliverance from something, meaning slavery in Egypt, but it is also deliverance to something, their own home, their own land in Canaan. This is the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Way back in Genesis, when God promised to make a great people of Abraham and to give him a land, this is the fulfillment of that promise. God's plan is revealed, and God says that he is doing this now because the suffering of his people has not gone unnoticed. Sometimes when we are suffering, when we are in difficult circumstances, it helps just to know, to realize that God is aware of what we're going through. God may not change those circumstances, but it is a comfort to know that he knows what we're going through. And so God says, I know what my people have suffered in Egypt. Moses still is hesitant regarding his role in the plan. In verse 3, in chapter 3, verse 4, he says, "Here I am." And then in 3:11, he says, "Who am I?" You notice the change. Here I am, but who am I? This will be the first of 8 objections that Moses will present to God in this encounter. And each time Moses is assured that God's presence will be with him. And that's the key. It's not that this won't be a factor. It's not that, oh, you're imagining this. No, this will be an obstacle. But the difference is that I will be with you. That's God's promise. So Moses, after saying, "Who am I?" he says, "Who are you? If the people ask me your name, what shall I tell them?" Rather than offending God, the question challenges him and leads God to further revelation. And so God's response is, "I am who I am." Now that can also be translated as, "I will be what or who I will be. And I kind of like that. I will be who I will be. Some see that as God withholding his actual name. The term Yahweh that we're so familiar with as the Hebrew name for God is actually the third person form of that verb, I will be who I will be, Yahweh. But in reality, this is an act of intimacy. It is a commitment to be unchanging in the interaction between God and God's people. I will be who I will be. I will not change. Mm-hmm. I will be consistent in who I am. Mm-hmm. And part of who he is a promise that he will be with his people. And so this is a very intimate revelation of God to his people. Now look at chapter 4 and let's look at verses 1 through 17. Then Moses answered, "But suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake. And Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Reach out your hand and seize it by the tail.' So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand. So that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Again the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." He put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, his hand was leprous, as white as snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back into your cloak." So he put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his body. If they will not believe you or heed the first sign, they may believe the second sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or heed you, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak." But he said, "O Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "What of your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the sign." So what objection does Moses offer in chapter 4, verse 1, and how does God answer it?
Moses feels he can't talk right.
No, that's coming later. In verse 1, what does he say? "Suppose they do not believe me or listen to me." And so how does God respond? Well, God responds with the display of his power. He says, "What's in your hand?" Moses said, "The staff." He says, "Throw it down." He does. It becomes a snake. He says, "Pick it up." And that's where faith really comes in. Moses picks it up and it becomes a staff again. Puts his hand in his cloak. He pulls it out. It's leprous. There was no cure for leprosy in that day. That was a death sentence. And then he puts his hand back in and it's restored. Now in verse 10, Moses notes his physical limitations. How does his view of himself differ from God's view? That's where he says, "I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now."
Well, he says he's slow of speech and slow of tongue.
Yeah.
That means he acts like he can't talk right.
Moses sees his limits, right?
Right, his limits.
Slow of speech, slow of tongue.
Right.
God sees the possibilities.
Right.
God sees him as his own creation. Mm-hmm. He says, "Who created people to be able to speak?" who created people to be mute or to be blind or to see, this kind of thing. In other words, all of that is in my control. So don't think of the limits that you have. Think of the power that I have. Are there ways in which a poor self-image can become a sin?
Say it again.
Are there ways in which a poor self-image can become a sin? Not saying it is a sin. We're saying it can become or lead to sin.
Maybe if it leads you to not do what God is asking you.
Right, right. If God has given you a gift, and because of your poor self-image, you refuse to exercise and develop that gift, then that's a rejection of a gift from God. So it can lead to a sin. It can lead to you're seeing yourself as something less than being created in the image of God. And that's what Scripture says we are. How do you distinguish between a legitimate lack of qualification for a task and an excuse based on an inadequate self-image and faith? How do you distinguish between those? That's tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, the only thing I can think of is having a willingness to try, you know, to make an attempt. When y'all know my love of baseball. I don't think I gave up on being a professional baseball player until I was in college. I went out for the team at Furman and I didn't make it. You know, they cut me. And I realized at that point that I was not going to play baseball professionally. But I tried. I gave it an effort. And I think that's the thing. You know, sometimes we've got to try. And sometimes we do have to admit, no, this is not what I'm called to do. But I'm not sure we can know that until we give it some kind of effort. Moses still has questions for God. He has doubts that the people will consider him a trustworthy leader. Why might he have had doubts about that?
Was he a stutterer?
Yeah, his speech impediment. What else? What had he done? What do we remember Moses doing? Murdering.
Oh, murder!
Yeah.
Yeah, he murdered
The taskmaster.
Yeah.
So it suggests that Moses had a bit of a temper, you know, and so he may be afraid that they're going to see him as some kind of hothead, you know, and not want to follow him. That he's going to get them into trouble. God shows great respect for this concern. He takes it seriously, and so he provides Moses with signs. Not so much signs of Moses' inherent ability, but signs of God's ability to use and work through Moses. Signs may be impressive, but they rarely result in belief. You know, we always say, oh, show me a sign. Usually signs are not what results in a belief. Belief is what helps us understand the sign and realize what the sign is saying to us.
Right.
The Israelites, though, saw the signs and believed. Who did not believe when he saw the signs? Pharaoh. Yeah. So Moses next appeals to his lack of eloquence. It has been suggested that he may well have had a speech impediment. And God gives a twofold response. First of all, he reminds Moses that it was he, God, who created Moses and all other humanity. He doesn't deny Moses' impediment. He just reminds Moses that he is the creator. And then God promises his presence and promises to provide Moses with the words and the ability to speak. You know, you don't worry about it. If you're willing, I will put the words in your mouth. I will give you the ability to form those words. Now, this doesn't mean that God will take away the impediment. Instead, he will work through the impediment. God calls us, warts and all. He doesn't clean us up and then use us. He uses us. He doesn't expect us to be perfect so that we can serve. He equips us to serve in spite of our imperfections. So now, Moses, having exhausted his excuses, simply asks God to send someone else. He's run out of excuses. He says, but just send somebody else. And this makes God angry. He has dealt with all of Moses' concerns with integrity. He's taken them seriously, and yet Moses is still resistant. So God goes to plan B. He says Aaron will be the spokesperson. Now, interestingly enough, the role outlined for Aaron here is not fulfilled. As you read through the story of Moses and his encounters with Pharaoh and all, Moses ends up speaking for himself. In fact, Aaron isn't mentioned in the climactic scenes in chapters 13 and 14. So, it seems that Moses may have gradually worked himself into the role that God planned for him all along. So this thing about Aaron was not meant to be a substitute. It was meant to be an encouragement for Moses. And Moses eventually is able to do what God calls him to do. So plan B actually becomes plan A. Right. It's what God intended all along. Can you think of a situation in which you felt inadequate to do something you felt God was calling you to do? Tell you a story from my experience. When I was working as youth minister in Greenwood, there was a group called Theolog that met about 5 times a year. It was a group of pastors and religion professors from upstate South Carolina that met, and someone would present a paper and they would discuss it. At Christmas every year, they met at the country club in Greenwood, South Carolina, and someone read or shared a Christmas story, and spouses were invited. So it was a little lighter fare for the Christmas meeting. These included the pastor I worked with, pastors of other churches that I respected. Some of my religion professors from Furman were in this group. And so I was invited to the Christmas meeting one year. It would be the first meeting, and that would let me become a part of the group. And so I was looking forward to that. The program was going to be supplied by Chuck Moats, who was our Minister of Education at Greenwood. Well, 2 days, I think, before the event, Chuck hurt his back. And he said, I can't do it. He was kind of confined at home. And so the pastor came to me and he said, didn't you write a Christmas story for one of our women's circle groups? Oh. And I said, yeah. He said, why don't you do that for Theolog? I said, no. I was intimidated. These people, and particularly the fact that these professors that I had at Furman. But he pushed and pushed, and so finally I agreed to do it. And the people were very gracious to me, and they asked me to do one again the next year, and I wound up doing 4 or 5. And that became the book of short stories that I had published. Those stories, the Christmas stories in that book, were the beginning of that book. So I felt unqualified. But somehow it was enough. I also kind of experienced that in my call to ministry. I felt a calling to ministry certainly by my junior year of high school, but I resisted that because I grew up in a small town. Ministers were kind of put on a pedestal, and I knew I wasn't perfect. And one of the things that helped me with that, and it's a kind of a strange way to get encouragement, I guess, but I was at a basketball game one night, high school basketball game, and the pastor of Brent's Baptist Church had a daughter who was my age, played on the basketball team. And the game was going terrible, and we felt like we were getting really bad calls from the referees and all, and he just lost it in the stands. He didn't cuss or anything like that, but he was yelling, he was vociferous. He obviously lost his temper. And I realized the next week he was still pastor of the Baptist church, you know. And I thought, well, you know, maybe those imperfections can be dealt with in some way.
Don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, and I think in my case they certainly have.
Oh.
How should our self-image be affected by our image of God?
Well, ideally, we should turn ourselves over to Him and let Him lead
Right.
us.
What else? What is it about our image and God's image that's important to remember?
Same likeness.
Right. We are
That's
created in the image of God.
Right.
How could we have a poor self-image if we understand and believe that we are created in the image of God? And so it's not who we are, it's what God can do through us.
Right.
And that's very much the point of the call of Moses. Any questions or comments?
Well, I
Let's
think
bow.
what stops a lot of people from getting tight with God is because they still have that self, ego, and pride in their system.
Yeah.
And you gotta get rid of that, all of that, and that's hard to do, that isn't easy.
And I think sometimes people, you know, do have an understanding of the holiness of God and their poor self-image, and I've heard people to say it's too late for me now. You know, I can't turn to God now. I've done too much. You know, it's never too late. God doesn't care what we have done. He cares that we turn to Him. That's what matters.
See,
Let's
that's
bow
what-
together for a closing prayer.
Okay,
Father, we're grateful to you for the way in which you call us and use us. We are awed at the thought that we are created in your image. Help us to understand that that means that when you call us, you prepare us, you equip us for what you call us to do, and help us to be ready and willing to serve in your name. Amen.